Hi, I'm Kristen Chrisman, and this is video 2 out of 5. I'm reading an essay that I wrote called Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, Trapped in a Cultural Script. And it has 8 sections to it, and I've already read sections 1 and 2. In this video, I'll be reading section 3. This cultural script pertains to a false drama that's being played out now in the international scene, where you've got innocent, quote, innocent victims, quote, rescuing heroes, and, quote, evil persecutors. So one of the things that makes people believe that Russia is an evil persecutor is the decades of propaganda that we've received, and our parents have received, and our grandparents have received, and it's inside his memory. And it makes it very easy for our brains to receive this information that, oh no, Russia's being evil. So what this video is about is called Cold War, Truth and Propaganda, because it's important to go back and look at some of the inaccuracies and lies that happened, and to get a different perspective on this, a broader perspective on the Cold War, instead of just seeing that as good versus evil. And as I mentioned in the first video, this complete essay is on countercurrents.org. We're expected to sit back, relax, and let all information fall into the ruts of our minds, shaped by decades of Cold War lies and propaganda. Imagine how furious John D Rockefeller was in the 1880s when Russian oil drillers struck enormous deposits in Baku on the Caspian Sea. Russia was able to sell oil to Europe at prices that undercut Rockefeller's Standard Oil. Cruel, underhanded, ruthless to his competitors, and lethally negligent towards his employees, Rockefeller, who had a history of selling temporarily at low prices to put his competitors out of business, wanted that European market. So Rockefeller, who had mercilessly swallowed up his American competitors, schemed to destroy Russian competition. He lowered prices for Europeans, raised prices for Americans, spread rumors questioning Russian oil safety, and barred cheaper Russian oil from U.S. consumers. This pattern of telling lies, pursuing greed, and not really caring at all about foreigners or Americans is a pattern that eerily persists in U.S. foreign policy. Of interest, Rockefeller, the son of a religious mother and a swindling father, somehow managed to think of himself as virtuous, another characteristic of U.S. foreign policy makers, even as they inflict violence and punishment on others. Of course, we're not supposed to question whether perhaps selfish economic rivalry was at the root of the Cold War. Even though the U.S. government has befriended and installed numerous brutal tyrants worldwide, particularly in Latin America, we're expected to be convinced that the Cold War was a U.S. fight against brutal tyranny. In fact, we're also supposed to think of the war against terror as a fight against tyranny, even though a major provocation of terrorism is the tyranny of Mideastern dictators, most of whom are strongly supported by the U.S. government. And we're certainly not supposed to learn about Islamism, whose leading theoretician Sayyid Qutb cherished Islam largely because in a truly Islamic state there would be true freedom from oppression, where no one is subjugated to another. We're supposed to believe the lie that the Cold War was a war in which the heroic U.S. government protected the freedom and humanity of innocent victims worldwide from the evil empire Russia. We're to believe it was a fight of good versus evil, not merely base economic rivalry, and not the result of capitalists' frustrations that they couldn't access the markets, resources, and profits of a communist nation. Charles Conant, his influential 1896 theory, set forth in his work, A History of Modern Banks of Issue, warned that U.S. capitalism would collapse unless the U.S. government worked closely with powerful banks and businesses to continually force open foreign markets and investment opportunities to increase profits. The U.S. had already conquered the Native Americans of the mainland, but Conant's theory helped drive U.S. imperialism and conquest across the oceans in search of markets abroad, thus ushering in the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War, a horrific war to subjugate Filipinos. Quotes of policymakers of the time clearly reveal their ultimate goal. They see the Philippines as the gateway to China's resources and markets. And even before the creation of the CIA and its coups, the law firm Sullivan & Cromwell was helping corporations strong-arm foreign nations to get the business deals they wanted abroad. The kleptocratic philosophy was then as it is today. Government, with its wealth of tax dollars, exists to serve the corporation. Rockefeller Standard Oil, which eventually purchased a stake in Baku's oil fields, lost millions of dollars when Russia became communist in 1918 and the Bolsheviks nationalized Baku's oil business. Perhaps it comes as no surprise then that beginning that same year, U.S. policymakers chose to dispatch 10,000 troops to the USSR to invade the USSR and battle against the Bolsheviks' Red Army in the Soviet Union's Civil War. Once the USSR fell in 1991 and transformed back into non-communist Russia, Azerbaijan, and several other independent nations with economies open to foreign investors and bankers, U.S. businessmen and investors eagerly continued where Rockefeller had left off. But forget all that. Media owner Henry Luce in the 1950s, owner of Life, Fortune, and Time magazines, together with his close friend Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles, both previously lawyers for Sullivan and Cromwell, helped indoctrinate millions of Americans with their fervent anti-communist views and false convictions that Moscow was behind reform movements everywhere. According to Luce, Dulles, and Dulles, movements in Latin America, Asia, and Africa to help the poor, the landless, and the worker were really just fronts for the coming Soviet invasion. Consequently, Allen Dulles' CIA put a stop to any reform leader who offered their people a brief window of hope for relief from poverty and injustice. Of course, had this director of intelligence actually spent more time developing his intelligence about the USSR and about reform movements worldwide, perhaps he would have learned that his theories were wrong before destroying the prospects and lives of so many people. But we're not supposed to ponder over U.S. appalling interference in foreign politics and elections worldwide, interference to the point of killing leaders and setting off decades of brutality under right-wing leaders, because that would make Russia's alleged attempts to influence American voters in the U.S. 2016 elections not seem that big of a deal at all. We're supposed to believe that Russia is evil. Russians are inferior and worthy of being the brunt of jokes and insults. And the Russian way of war is more diabolical than the American way. We're supposed to believe that Putin is particularly evil and must be toppled, degraded, destroyed. And we're supposed to never let die the flames of faith that the U.S. government, even though it has interfered in multiple elections worldwide for decades, is eternally right and well-intentioned. Most importantly, we're to trust that the ludicrous, antagonizing, confrontational U.S. approach of responding to conflict and fears with wars, weapons shipments, and sanctions actually isn't ludicrous at all, but is the rescuing hero's key to nobly and fairly resolving international conflicts, even though such an approach doesn't address a single cause of conflict. Our memories of history also must comply with the script of evil persecutor, innocent victim, and rescuing hero. And here I'm going to wing it a little bit. I'm going to add some things into my essay from my unpublished works that I've been working on for 20 years, because I thought I should add a little bit more. So I might not sound as smooth, but I want you to have this information. This is about history, how history has to comply with the script. So we're supposed to juxtapose Joseph Stalin's horrific brutality and paranoia over every Russian action throughout time as proof of Russia's evil. And we're expected to let the memories of the U.S. military's ungodly behavior towards Native Americans and a variety of other nations quietly glide out of our minds. Don't even read D. Brown's Bury My Heart, a Wounded Knee, or you'll get the wrong impression about U.S. government benevolence. U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War had a couple characteristics, and one of these was prejudice and irrational fears. Prejudice and fear against communism appeared even prior to Stalin's cruelties, as, quote, harshly expressed in the Red Scare of 1919 to 1920, an attitude among many prominent Americans in the 1920s that the Bolsheviks were godless, uncivilized, anti-capitalist, violent, destructive revolutionaries who chained their workers like slaves to an authoritarian system. That's a quote from Patterson. It's in the endnotes. Actually, that isn't in the endnotes because I'm adding this in now, but it's from Patterson. It's called U.S. Foreign Policy. While opposition to the Bolsheviks' violence is understandable, why Americans felt such heated hatred for the Bolsheviks is not clear. Even though Bolsheviks and Lenin were violent revolutionaries, it's not proportionate to feel such anger and fear towards Bolsheviks as compared to any other group of people who have been violent and cruel, such as the regimes under the earlier czars, or the Americans against the Native American, Indians, and African Americans. It's also not clear why some violent revolutionaries are despised and feared as ungodly and virulent, while others, such as the American revolutionaries, are considered to be about as close to the divine as you can get. During Stalin's rule, it was horrible. And that's important to be clear about. Stalin was undeniably atrocious. But it's critically important to distinguish between Stalin's own penchant for cruelty and whether or not he had the capacity or wish to spread that cruelty to other nations, and the existence or non-existence of intentions and abilities amongst other communists around the world to commit cruelty. These are different things. If a cruel leader were female, we would not associate her cruelty with her gender. If a cruel leader were Christian or Muslim, we would not associate his cruelty with his religion. If a cruel leader were capitalist or socialist, we wouldn't associate his cruelty with his economic ideology. No matter the gender, religion, ethnicity, or political or economic ideology of a cruel leader, most likely the cruelty is not directly associated with any of those general categories. But U.S. policymakers use Stalin's cruelty as proof that communism is evil. So a second aspect of this foreign policy of the U.S. was this toughness, the belief in toughness. The get tough policy of Truman included adoption of George Kennan's containment policy. Mechanistic Soviet power, Kennan wrote, quote, moves inexorably along a direction, stopping only when it meets some unanswerable force. Containment policy was harshly criticized by some as the tragic neglect of diplomacy, but with the image of the USSR, some evil, belligerent robot that wouldn't stop on its own, containment was believed to be essential. Kennan certainly was influenced by his earlier experience as ambassador to Russia in the 1930s, during which time he attended many of the purge trials. He witnessed firsthand the nightmarish realities of murder, secrecy, conspiratorial thinking, and paranoia in the USSR under Stalin. The problem is, these undeniably atrocious and sickening aspects of the USSR under Stalin were not necessarily aspects of life that the USSR was trying to export, and they were not necessarily aspects of communism. It's not as though the communists in Czechoslovakia's government in 1946, for example, or the Greek communists in 1944, were necessarily people who were going to promote murder, secrecy, and pledges of allegiance to Stalin. It's true that Lenin's form of Marxism firmly believed in violence against imperial powers. And it's true that Stalin behaved towards just about everyone with violence, friends and enemies alike. Yet it's also true that Marxism and communism, their goals and means, are understood differently by different peoples. The movements are not homogeneous, and the specter of a monolithic communist force out to take over the world and execute all opposition does not seem likely, since there were severe conflicts of opinion between communists of different nations and within the same nation. The advocacy or rejection of forceful or violent methods of human relations is a variable that is independent of Marxism and communism. And in my perspective, Stalin's desire to destroy human life was not a feature of communism itself, but primarily a feature of Stalin's sick mind, with some ideological support from Lenin's belief in violence. Marxism itself, however, had at its heart not repression, not violence, and not Soviet domination of the world, but the equality of each person from whatever nation. This desire for equality and the rejection of the imperialism of Europe and the US is what connects Marxism with the nationalist movements it sparked in Asia and Latin America, as well as the pan-Islamic movement. As I mentioned, that also believed that a truly Islamic state would not have anybody subjugated to anybody else. They'd be equal. Often these ideologies at their heart, whether it's an economic, political, or religious ideology, they often have very noble ideas. But then they get distorted. But it's important to see what the noble aim was in the start, because some people who follow those ideologies still have those noble aims, and that's what they're trying for. So you can't blacklist them all as having evil aims. This rejection of the superiority and domination of the West is very important to recognize. For the U.S., the popularly held truth of the Cold War seems to have been that the U.S. was defending freedom against an evil empire. But for many other peoples and nations, the Marxist movement is not seen as evil, but as good, as a striving for equality. With regard to the Get Tough policy, Truman had this Get Tough policy with the USSR that developed early in 1946. Instead of remembering the lesson of how the World War I peace treaty so humiliated Germany as to give rise to Hitler and the Nazis, the U.S. insisted again and again, and it still does, upon remembering only one lesson. Appeasement of Hitler led to Nazi belligerence and domination. We always hear that, don't appease, don't appease. And instead of making any distinction between appeasement of illegitimate interests on the one hand, and attempts to understand another's legitimate fears on the other hand, all suggestions for the U.S. to be anything less than tough with the enemy seem to be lumped together as appeasement. And that's why we get into problems today with Russia, thinking, oh, we can't listen to their legitimate fears. That's appeasement. It's not appeasement. It's listening to their legitimate fears. It's being humane and caring and fair. In 1946, Churchill, no longer Prime Minister, made his famous speech about the Iron Curtain that had descended across the continent. And those words right there, Iron Curtain, were loaded words. They shouldn't have been used. Reactions were mixed. Stalin paralleled Churchill to Hitler. And with good reason. Churchill actually ended up pretty much allying himself with the Nazis in Greece after World War II and throwing the Greek communists to the Nazis, or to the Nazi collaborators. Truman, however, was pleased with the Get Tough language of this Iron Curtain talk. Secretary Henry Wallace, a dissenter from the Get Tough approach, and this is a quote from Patterson, feared that the Anglo-Americans were trying to, quote, strut around the world and tell people where to get off. Wallace, who was also former vice president under FDR, Roosevelt, explained, quote, getting tough never brought anything real and lasting, whether for schoolyard bullies or businessmen or world powers. The tougher we get, the tougher the Russians will get. And it's not because, oh, they're tough, we're going to get tough. It's the tougher we get, the more scared they get. They have to be tough to defend themselves, and vice versa. Truman fired Wallace. That's what happened during the Cold War. If you disagreed with the Get Tough policy, you either resigned or got fired. Truman fired Wallace and lumped him together with the Reds and the phonies. But looking back, some of these policymakers saw the light in hindsight. Remembering the period following World War II, Senator William Fulbright recalled, quote, we were sold on the idea that Stalin was out to dominate the world. I didn't have the knowledge or the foresight to make a judgment at that time. Henry Wallace sensed it. He had a feeling about it. But he was ridiculed for being a visionary and appeaser, unrealistic. George Kennan himself, the creator of the Containment Policy, who'd been very upset by what he had seen in the USSR in the 1930s, he later concluded that Americans, especially military planners, exaggerated Soviet behavior and created, quote, the image of the totally inhuman and totally malevolent adversary, and, quote, reconjured it daily, week after week, month after month, year after year, until it takes on every feature of flesh and blood and becomes the daily companion of those who cultivate it, so that any attempt on anyone's part to deny its reality appears as an act of treason or frivolity. That's what's happening today. If you speak out, when I try to tell people this drama, this is wrong, people all think, they don't all think this, but some are quick to jump on me and think that I'm in favor of Russian violence. I'm not in favor of Russian violence, but I'm not in favor of this drama and the things that provoked Russian violence. But it's not treasonous for me to speak out. I'm trying to solve this problem because people are being brainwashed, and they're brainwashing themselves too. And those are examples of disagreements within the administration. There are disagreements in the Carter administration, for example, with Cyrus Vance, Secretary of State, and the Ambassador Sullivan on one side, and then Brzezinski on the other. And Wallace eventually, Cyrus Vance resigned in opposition to Brzezinski's fierce anti-communism. And I'll mention just one more example. When you think of the whole ideology as bad, it's a big mistake, because in Czechoslovakia in the 1940s, they had communists within their government. It was led by a non-communist leader, but they were communists. And the U.S. said to them, like, they were going to cut off, I think it was a loan from the Export-Import Bank, unless the Czechs kicked the communists out of the government. So here the U.S. is interfering very much in Czechoslovakia's internal affairs, thinking that communists are bad. And that the Czechs thought, the U.S. thought the Americans were idiots for doing this. Because Americans didn't understand. They just saw communists all as Stalin. And even Stalin wasn't trying to promote his evil abroad. But what's going on here too is the creation of a negative Pygmalion. Creating a negative image, believing in this negative image, and then making the enemy actually become that negative image. And that's going on with Russia now too. Like, if the U.S. and others think, oh yeah, NATO has to expand because of Russia. And then Russia's afraid and saying, no, we don't want NATO to expand. And we're like, no, we have to expand. And then Russia invades. And then we're like, oh yeah, look, Russia invaded. That's proof. Russia's evil. But Russia wouldn't have done that had NATO not been expanding and had the missiles not been getting closer and closer to Russia, and had there not been a U.S. promoted coup in Ukraine. So there's a negative Pygmalion effect that goes on when you think of Russia as evil and you act hostilely as if it's evil. It makes it threatened, and then it acts evilly. And then it's trapped. So that concludes video number 2. Thank you very, very much. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about Russian fears, because the script that's being promoted is that Ukraine is the innocent victim, Russia is the evil persecutor, and the US and NATO and others are the rescuing heroes. So to create that script, we not only have the Cold War propaganda already brainwashing our minds for decades, but what happens now is two big things happen. One, any Russian fears are dismissed as invalid. That way, if all the Russian fears are absurd, then we can say, well, Russia surely isn't acting out of fear, because those fears are absurd. Russia must be acting out of malice and aggression. So that's one thing that's going on. The other thing that's going on is the greed and the aggression behind the U.S. and other actors is being concealed. And that makes the U.S. and others just seem innocent. And they're not. I'm not trying to say that U.S. is all evil and Russia is all innocent. But I'm trying to show that Russia's not all evil and U.S. and Ukraine being all innocent. It's a mixture. So in my essay, I'm really pointing out that the fears of Russia, and I'm really going to be pointing out the greed of U.S. because I'm trying to get some balance back into this view of international conflict, because only with a truthful, comprehensive look at the conflict can we actually resolve it. And if we look at it truthfully, you know what? We can resolve it non-violently. It's very, very easy. The puzzle pieces can all fit. It's not hard if you look at it fairly. So thank you very, very much for listening. That was video 2, and next we'll be doing video 3. Thank you.